The gun was already pressed against his chest before Mark Brandon understood how completely he had failed himself. He stood at the edge of the San Antonio River, boots swallowed by dark mud, the evening sky bleeding out in shades of copper and red above the water. Across from him, close enough that he could see the tears cutting silent lines down her dusty face, stood Amber Walter, the woman he had cooked terrible meals for, laughed with on cold nights, and somewhere along the way, had quietly given the most dangerous thing a lawman could give anyone, his trust. Her hand was shaking, the gun was not. Behind her, somewhere deep in the darkening tree line, Gerald Paulo was waiting for a sound. One sound, the flat final crack of a single shot. Mark didn't reach for his badge. He didn't reach for his weapon. He just looked at her, the way a man looks at something he knows he is about to lose forever. "You don't have to do this, Amber." She said nothing. But her eyes, God, her eyes, were breaking, and a woman who came only to kill does not arrive at the riverbank with a breaking heart. Something had changed. The question was whether it had changed enough. But this story didn't begin at the river. It began 3 months earlier, 2 in the morning, inside a quiet office that smelled of burnt coffee and old paper. Mark Brandon was not a man built for rest. He was 34, broad across the shoulders, with dark eyes that catalogued everything and forgot nothing. San Antonio knew him as the sheriff who didn't bend. Not for money, not for pressure, not for the kind of quiet political threats that made other lawmen suddenly develop poor memories. For 2 years, every spare hour he had went into one case. Gerald Paulo, businessman, community figure, and beneath all of it, a trafficker, who moved human beings across the Texas border like they were freight, protected by enough connections to keep the law looking the other way. 16 people had vanished along Paulo's known routes. 16 red marks on Mark's map. Witnesses, patterns, a route he had nearly confirmed. He was 2 weeks away, maybe less, from having everything he needed to bring Paulo down for good. Gerald Paulo felt it, the way a predator feels a trap before he sees it. And so he did what powerful, cornered men have always done throughout the history of the American West. He didn't send a threat. He didn't send a warning. He sent a woman named Amber Walter to San Antonio with one instruction. Don't come back until the sheriff is dead. If this story already has you, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now let's get back to this, because what Amber Walter did the moment she rode into San Antonio, nobody saw it coming, not even her. Amber Walter rode into San Antonio on a Wednesday morning like she had nowhere urgent to be. That was the first thing people noticed. Not her face, though her face was worth noticing, with sharp cheekbones and pale green eyes that caught the light in a way that made men forget what they were saying mid-sentence. What people noticed first was her stillness. Most strangers who arrived in San Antonio arrived with some kind of hunger showing. Tired eyes scanning for a boarding house, dusty hands reaching for water, mouths already forming questions. Amber arrived the way a woman arrives when she has already studied a place before setting foot in it. She knew where the sheriff's office was before she asked. She knew the name of the boarding house on Cortez Street before the stable boy mentioned it. She took a slow ride down the main road, eyes moving calm and deliberate across storefronts, across faces, some across the distance between the jailhouse window and the street below. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman simply taking in a new town. She was not. She was measuring it. Gerald Paulo had given her everything she needed. Mark Brandon's routine, his habits, the roads he rode alone, the hours he kept. All she needed now was to get close enough, and Amber Walter had never once failed to get close enough. She took a room at the Cortez boarding house, and that same evening, she went to the only place in San Antonio where a woman could sit alone without drawing the wrong kind of attention. May Hollis's dining hall on the south end of town. Mark Brandon was already seated at the corner table when she walked in, not because he had followed her, but because May Hollis's dining hall was where he ate every Wednesday evening without variation. Deputy Cole Reyes sat across from him, pushing beans around a tin plate and talking about a fence dispute on the eastern edge of town that Mark was only half listening to. He was tired, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes and doesn't leave after sleep. The Paulo case was close. He could feel it the way you feel a storm before the sky changes color. But close wasn't finished, and every day Paulo operated was another day Mark couldn't account for. He noticed Amber the moment she stepped through the door because noticing people was as natural to him as breathing. Lone woman, composed, no ring, traveling bag, but no visible exhaustion. He registered her the way he registered everything, filed it, moved on. What he did not register, could not have known, was that she had already clocked him from the doorway before her eyes so much as drifted across the rest of the room. She chose a table with a clean sightline to his. She ordered quietly. She did not stare, and when their eyes met once, briefly, she looked away first, which was exactly what Gerald Paulo had coached her to do. Let him come to you. Men like Mark Brandon don't trust what chases them, but they always move toward what doesn't. It started with a question about coffee. Mark Brandon was not a man who started conversations with strangers, not out of coldness, but because his mind was almost always elsewhere, turning over case details like stones in a river. But on the Thursday morning after Amber arrived, he found himself at May Hollis's counter earlier than usual, waiting on a pot that was taking too long, and she was already there, sitting 2 stools down with a cup she hadn't touched, staring out the window at the quiet San Antonio street, like she was reading something written in the dust. He almost said nothing. Then she turned slightly and said, without looking at him, "Does the coffee here always take this long? Is that just for strangers?" Her voice was even, dry, not flirtatious, which was precisely what made him respond. He told her, May Hollis made the best coffee in San Antonio, but treated the process like a religious ceremony that could not be rushed. She almost smiled, not quite. He sat down 2 stools away, and they waited together in silence that was somehow not uncomfortable. And when the coffee finally arrived, it was, as promised, worth every minute. She said so. He agreed, and that was all. 2 sentences, 1 almost smile, and a shared cup of patience. But Mark Brandon rode back to his office that morning thinking about her eyes, and he couldn't explain why, and he didn't try to. What followed over the next 2 weeks was so gradual that Mark never saw it as anything other than coincidence, which was exactly how Amber had been trained to move. She was at May Hollis's 3 mornings out of 5, never waiting for him, never positioning herself, just present, the way furniture is present, comfortable, and unremarkable, until suddenly you notice it has always been there. Mark noticed her the way he noticed most things, quietly, from a distance, without committing to an opinion. He was not a man who warmed to strangers easily, and a woman who had arrived in San Antonio alone, with no visible connections and no stated reason for staying, was exactly the kind of detail his instincts flagged without making noise about it. He was polite when they crossed paths, nothing more. When she tried to spark a conversation one morning, something about the weather turning, about whether San Antonio got cold in the evenings, he answered in 2 words and returned to his coffee. When she laughed at something May Hollis said from across the counter, he registered it the way you register weather. Present, noted, moved on. It was Cole Reyes who pointed it out first, one afternoon when Mark passed the dining hall window without going in. "You've been avoiding May's on the mornings that woman is there." Mark told him he didn't know what he was talking about. Cole smiled into his coffee and said nothing else. But he wasn't wrong, and the fact that Mark had noticed he was doing it, without once admitting it to himself, said more than he was willing to examine.
It was a Friday evening when everything shifted, not because Amber did anything different, but because San Antonio did. A fire broke out on the north end of town just after sundown. Nobody died, but the Hargrove family lost their storefront and everything inside it, 3 years of work gone in 40 minutes of flame and black smoke. By the time the fire was fully out, half the town had gathered in the street, passing water buckets, pulling salvageable goods from the wreckage, wrapping the Hargrove children in borrowed blankets. Mark was there from the first alarm, coordinating, directing, keeping order the way he always did, calm on the outside, burning through energy on the inside. It was past midnight when the crowd finally thinned. He was standing alone at the edge of the scorched building, hat in hand, staring at what was left, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, one hand instinctively moving toward his hip. It was Amber. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee from May Hollis's, which the old woman had kept open through the whole ordeal. Amber held one out, without a word. No conversation starter, no attempt to fill the silence, just coffee, extended toward a tired man in the dark. Mark looked at her for a moment that long, assessing, look, he gave everything and then he took it. They stood there together in the smoke-smelling night, drinking in silence, watching the last embers die, and for the first time since she had arrived in San Antonio, Mark Brandon did not feel the need to keep his distance. That crack in the wall was small, but Amber had been trained to find small cracks. What she did not expect was what happened on the walk back. Mark had said goodnight and turned toward his office when his boot caught the edge of a loose board on the sidewalk and he stumbled, not badly, just enough to slosh the remainder of his coffee across his shirt and mutter something under his breath that made Amber laugh before she could stop herself. It was the same short, unguarded laugh from weeks ago, the one that surprised her when it came out. Mark looked at her, then looked down at his shirt. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth pulled into something that was almost a smile. 6 years as sheriff, he said, and the thing that gets me is a loose board. She pressed her lips together, trying to hold the laugh in, and failed completely. And just like that, in the space of a stumble and a ruined shirt, something between them loosened. They walked the remaining block together. He asked where she was headed. She said the boarding house. He said he'd walk her not warmly, just practically, the way a sheriff walks a woman home at midnight in a town still buzzing from a fire. But at the boarding house door, he paused and said, "The coffee helped. Thank you. Not much." But from Mark Brandon, it was everything. Amber smiled and went inside. And, standing alone in the dark hallway of the Cortez boarding house, with the smell of smoke still in her hair, she made a decision she hadn't anticipated making. She would take a little longer with this one. That was what she told herself. Just a little longer. She almost believed it. 3 weeks into her stay, Amber Walter made her first mistake. She let herself enjoy a conversation without working it. It happened on a Sunday afternoon when the town was slow and the heat sat heavy over San Antonio like a wool blanket that nobody asked for. Mark had finished his rounds early and stopped at May Hollis's out of habit, and Amber was already there, not watching the door, genuinely absorbed in a book she had borrowed from the boarding house. He sat down across from her without announcing himself and said, "Any good?" She looked up, then at the book, then back at him with an expression that said she hadn't decided yet. He ordered coffee. She dog-eared her page. And for the next hour they talked.
You honestly expect me to believe you caught that rooster yourself?
I assure you, Sheriff, he practically jumped into my arms.
Well, now, I reckon that's a story for the books.
Not the careful, circling conversation of the previous weeks where she steered and he deflected, but real conversation, the kind that moves fast and doubles back and loses track of time. He told her about growing up in a small town outside Austin where everybody knew your business before you did. She told him about learning to sew from a woman who wasn't her mother because her mother had left when she was 9. She hadn't planned to say that. It came out between one sentence and the next, and she felt it leave her mouth before she could pull it back. Mark didn't press, didn't offer sympathy in that hollow way people do. He just nodded slowly and said, "Some absences shape you more than presences ever could." She looked at him for a moment longer than she should have. Then she looked at her coffee. That evening, she sat at the small desk in her boarding house room and wrote her weekly report to Gerald Paulo. Her hand moved slower than usual. The report said progress was steady. That was true. What it didn't say was that she had spent an hour that afternoon laughing at stories about a mule named Patterson that had once bitten 3 deputies in a single morning, or that she had walked back to the boarding house afterward feeling lighter than she had felt in longer than she could remember. It didn't say that Mark Brandon was not what Gerald Paulo had described, not a stubborn obstacle, not a self-righteous, badge-wearing inconvenience. He was a man who carried something heavy and never once asked anyone to help him carry it. Amber had met many men in her line of work. She understood them the way a card player understands the deck, every type accounted for, every move anticipated. Mark did not fit any category she owned. He was careful, but not cold. Strong, but not hardened. And the way he listened, really listened, like what you said mattered enough to sit with before responding, was the kind of thing a woman noticed whether she meant to or not. She sealed the letter. She told herself she was in control. She had told herself that before, about other Marks in other towns, and it had always been true. She picked up the letter, put it down. Picked it up again, she was in control. Outside her window, San Antonio settled into its quiet Friday night sounds, distant laughter, a horse somewhere, the wind moving through the street. Amber Walter stared at the sealed letter for a long time before she finally walked it to the post. It was Cole Reyes who first said it out loud. He came into the office on a Monday morning, set a tin cup on Mark's desk, and stood there a half second too long before saying, "You seem different lately." Mark didn't look up from the papers in front of him. Different how? It wasn't a question. Cole picked his words the way a man picks his way across a frozen river, carefully, testing each step. Lighter, like something got some of the weight off you. Mark said nothing. Cole nodded slowly and left it there, which was one of the things Mark respected most about him. He knew when a door was closed. But the observation stayed in the room long after Cole walked out of it. Because Mark knew it was true. He had noticed it himself. The way you notice a change in weather before you can name what shifted. He was sleeping better. The case files on his desk felt less like a wall he was pushing against and more like a problem he was solving. On Wednesday mornings, he no longer had to decide whether to go to May Hollis's. He just went, and Amber was usually there, and they usually talked, and he usually rode back to his office afterward with his coffee finished and his mind clearer than it had been the night before. He had not examined this too carefully. Examining things too carefully had a way of ruining them. But on that Monday morning, after Cole's observations settled into the silence, Mark pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk and looked at the Paulo case files for a long time without touching them. He had let 3 weeks pass without a significant update. That had never happened before. He told himself it was a natural pause in the investigation, that he was waiting on a document from the land registry that would confirm Paulo's route through the southern quarter. That was true. What was also true was that he had spent time he would normally have dedicated to the case sitting in May Hollis's dining hall, talking about mules and childhood and the particular loneliness of towns that knew your name but not your Rex. He pulled the files out and spread them across the desk and made himself look at them the way he had looked at them 18 months ago, when the weight of 16 red marks on a map was fresh enough to keep him awake at night. 16 people, names he had written down, backgrounds he had traced, families he had spoken to who still didn't know where their people were. He sat with that for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and got back to work. He stayed until past midnight. Cole found him there in the morning, asleep at his desk, case files spread around him like a city he had been mapping in his sleep. Cole set a fresh cup of coffee down quietly and didn't say a word about lighter. But 2 days later, while Mark was out on his rounds, Cole was tidying the office when something on the desk caught his eye. A name on one of the older intake documents, a list of known associates and operatives connected to Gerald Paulo's network, compiled 8 months ago from a source in El Paso. Cole read the name twice. Then he sat down slowly in Mark's chair, the document in his hand, his coffee going cold beside him. Something in his chest went very still. He read the entry again, the town, the description, the connection. Then he set the document face down on the desk, stood up, and walked to the window. He stood there for a long time, watching the street below, watching the people moving through their ordinary Monday morning, watching May Hollis's dining hall across the road, watching the door.
Cole didn't tell him that day, or the next. He told himself he needed to be sure. That a name on an 8-month-old document from a source he couldn't fully verify wasn't enough to bring to a tribesman like Mark Brandon, who would want evidence the way a surgeon wants a steady hand before he cuts. That was partly true. The other part, Cole didn't examine too closely, was that he had seen Mark's face on Wednesday mornings. He had seen what lighter looked like on a man who had been carrying something heavy for 2 years, without complaint. And he was not sure he was ready to be the one who took that away, so he watched instead. He paid attention in the careful, unannounced way that good deputies do, noting when Amber arrived at May Hollis's, how long she stayed, what direction she walked after. He started cross-referencing the old El Paso documents against newer information that had come in from contacts along the southern route. What he found did not make him feel better. It made him feel the way a man feels when he has been hoping he misread something and discovers he read it exactly right. On the third day, he folded the relevant documents into his jacket, walked into the office while Mark was reviewing the land registry papers he had finally received, set them on the desk without a word, and sat down across from him. Mark looked at the documents, then at Cole. Cole said, "Take your time with those." Then he got up and went to stand by the window, because he did not want to see Mark Brandon's face when he understood what he was reading. He heard the exact moment it happened. Not because Mark said anything, because he stopped making any sound at all. The silence that followed was the longest Cole Reyes had ever sat inside. Mark did not move for a full minute. He sat at his desk with the documents in front of him, and the kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm. It comes from a man holding himself together through sheer discipline while something inside him is coming apart at the seams. Cole kept his eyes on the street below. A woman was hanging washing across the road. 2 boys were chasing a dog past the feed store. San Antonio moved through its ordinary afternoon completely indifferent to the fact that something had just broken inside the sheriff's office. When Mark finally spoke, his voice was flat and even in the way that is far more frightening than anger. "How long have you known?" Cole told him 3 days. He told him why he waited. Mark said nothing to that. He closed the documents, opened them again. Read a particular section one more time, as though the words might have rearranged themselves into something less damaging if he looked at them long enough. They had not. Cole turned from the window and looked at him then. Really looked. And what he saw on Mark Brandon's face was something he had never seen there before in 6 years. Not rage, not betrayal. Something quieter and far more permanent than either. He recognized it because he had seen it once on his own father's face years ago, after a loss that couldn't be undone. It was the look of a man who already knows, before he has fully accepted it, that nothing is going to go back to the way it was. Mark stood up, put on his hat. "Don't follow me," he said, and he walked out into the San Antonio afternoon alone. He rode out to the river, not because he had planned to, because his horse knew the way and he had stopped giving directions somewhere on the edge of town where the buildings thinned out and the land opened into the wide, flat quiet of the Texas afternoon. The San Antonio River was low this time of year, moving slow and copper-colored in the late light, and Mark sat on its bank for a long time without dismounting, just looking at the water the way a man looks at something that has no opinion about his problems. He had built the Paulo case on the belief that he could read people. 6 years of sheriffing, 2 years of hunting one of the most careful criminals in South Texas, and he had not seen it. Had not seen her. Every conversation replayed itself now, with new information underneath it, the way a painting looks different when you learn what it was painted over. The morning she had offered him coffee in the smoke and dark after the Hargrove fire. The Sunday afternoon at May Hollis's, when she had talked about her mother leaving. And he had felt the particular trust of someone sharing something they hadn't planned to share. The laugh. That short, unguarded laugh that had seemed too real to be performed. He pressed his palm flat against his horse's neck and felt the animal's warmth and steadiness beneath his hand, and tried to decide what was real and what had been constructed for his benefit. The problem was, he couldn't separate them cleanly, and that uncertainty was almost worse than a clean betrayal would have been. He stayed at the river until the light went, and the first stars came out cold and sharp above the Texas plain. What he did not know, sitting alone at that riverbank, was that Amber Walter was in her room at the Cortez boarding house at that exact moment, and she was not writing a report to Gerald Paulo. She was staring at a letter she had started 3 times and abandoned 3 times, each draft beginning with a different version of the same impossible sentence. The first draft started with, "I can't do this." The second started with, "I need more time." The third, she had gotten no further than his name before she put the pen down and sat back and looked at the ceiling. Gerald Paulo had sent a message 2 days ago asking for a timeline. His patience, which had never been generous, was running out. She had given him progress reports that were technically accurate and strategically vague, buying herself time she couldn't fully account for even to herself. Now the walls were closing and she knew it. She got up and stood at the window and looked at the dark San Antonio street below. The same street she had measured so carefully on the morning she arrived, cataloging distances and routines and exit routes. She looked at it now and saw something different. She saw May Hollis's light still burning across the road. She saw the sheriff's office window dark, which meant Mark was not there, which meant he was somewhere out in the night, with whatever he was carrying tonight. She didn't know what he was carrying, but she knew it was heavy. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and closed her eyes. Gerald Paulo's message sat unanswered on the desk behind her. San Antonio breathed its quiet night breath, indifferent and steady. And Amber Walter stood at her window and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something she had no training for. The specific and paralyzing fear of losing something that was never supposed to be hers in the first place. She came to his office the next morning. Mark was already at his desk when she pushed the door open. She said, "It's been a while." He didn't look up from the papers in front of him. The scratch of his pen continued without interruption. She stepped inside and let the silence sit for a moment before saying, "Are you avoiding me again?" He said nothing, just turned a page. She studied him from across the room, the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man who is working very hard at appearing unbothered, and something small and cold moved through her chest. She cleared her throat. "I came to check on you." He stopped writing then, set his pen down with the kind of deliberate care that has nothing to do with the pen. He looked up at her for the first time, and his eyes were not the eyes she had learned over Wednesday mornings and slow conversations. They were the eyes he used for work. "Why are you really here, Amber?" It wasn't a question. It was a door being opened from the wrong side. The silence that followed lasted only 3 seconds, but she felt every one of them, and in those 3 seconds, reading his face, the flatness of it, the careful distance of it, the way he was looking at her like a fact he was deciding what to do with, she understood. She felt the floor of everything shift beneath her. "You know," she said. He held her gaze without blinking. "I know." She closed the door behind her and told him everything. What happened next was not forgiveness. Mark Brandon was not built for fast forgiveness, and he would not have insulted either of them by pretending otherwise. He turned from the window and told her that what she had given him was enough to move on Paulo, enough to finally close a case that had taken 2 years of his life and 16 names. On a map, he still couldn't return to their families. He told her he would need her testimony, that Gerald Paulo was not a man who accepted loose ends, and the moment he suspected she had turned, her life would be worth considerably less than it already was. She said she understood. He looked at her for a long moment, the same face, the same pale green eyes that had looked away first across May Hollis's dining hall all those weeks ago. He could not yet reconcile what she had come here to do with what she had chosen to do instead. But she had handed him everything at considerable cost to herself. That meant something. "Go back to the boarding house," he said quietly. "Don't contact Paulo. I need 2 days." She nodded and moved toward the door. She had her hand on the frame when he said her name, just her name, nothing attached to it. She stopped but didn't turn around. Then he said, "I'm glad you told me." She left without answering. But outside on the San Antonio street, Amber Walter pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 3 weeks. The letter arrived on a Thursday evening, and it contained 4 words that undid everything. "I have your sister." Amber sat on the edge of the boarding house bed and read it 3 times as though repetition might change what it said. It didn't. Below the 4 words were instructions. Simple, precise, the way Gerald Paulo did everything. "Mark Brandon, the Riverside. Tonight, no deputies. No warning. Finish what you came to do, or your sister finishes with me." She set the letter down on the bed beside her and sat very still for a long time. In the 2 days since she had walked out of Mark's office, she had told herself it was over. That the testimony she had given him, the names and routes and holding locations, meant that Paulo's walls were already closing, and her sister would be safe inside whatever protection Mark's federal case could provide. She had almost believed it. Paulo had known she would almost believe it. That was why he had waited until Thursday evening, when the federal documents were signed but not yet moved on, when Mark was 2 days away from having everything in place, when pulling her back would cost the most. She stood up, walked to the window. San Antonio was settling into its quiet evening below her. Lanterns coming on one by one down the main street. The smell of supper fires drifting up from the boarding house kitchen. She thought about a Sunday afternoon at May Hollis's, and a conversation that had moved fast and doubled back and lost track of time. She thought about her sister's face. Then she picked up the gun from the nightstand and walked out into the dark. She was already at the river when Mark arrived. He came alone because she had sent word through a boy at the stable. Just his name and the river and the hour, nothing else. Which was enough because it was from her, and he was still, despite everything, a man who showed up. He came through the trees at the river's edge and saw her standing at the water, her back to him, the copper surface of the San Antonio River, black. Now in the night, he said her name. She turned around, and he knew immediately that something was wrong. Not from her face, which was composed the way she had trained it to be, but from her eyes, which had never learned to lie as well as the rest of her. He took a step toward her. She raised the gun. He stopped. His voice was low and steady. "Talk to me." She didn't talk. She looked at him across the short distance between them. This man who had taken her coffee in the dark after a fire, who had stumbled over a loose board and made her laugh before she could stop herself, who had said, "I'm glad you told me," through a doorway without asking for anything in return. Her hand was shaking. The gun was not. She thought about her sister. She thought about the 19-year-old girl in El Paso who had been swallowed whole by Gerald Paulo's world and had never fully found her way back, out. She thought about what it would mean to finally, completely be free of him. The shot cracked across the water before Mark heard her exhale. He staggered backward, hand going to his side, and went down hard in the mud at the river's edge. The silence that followed was absolute. Amber stood at the riverside with the gun at her side and looked at the man on the ground and felt something inside her go very quiet and very cold. Mark's breathing was ragged but present. His hand pressed flat against his side. He looked up at her from the mud with those dark eyes that missed nothing, and what she saw in them was not anger. It was worse than anger. It was the specific devastation of a man who had chosen, against every instinct he owned, to trust, and paid for it at a riverside in the dark. She took one step toward him, then stopped, then turned and walked into the trees and disappeared into the San Antonio night, because Gerald Paulo was waiting, and her sister was waiting, And whatever she had felt on that riverbank was a weight she would have to carry alone into whatever came next. Mark Brandon lay in the mud, at the river's edge, alive but bleeding, staring up at a sky full of cold Texas stars. The case was still open. Paulo was still out there. And the woman who had just shot him was already gone. Some stories don't end at the river. They just begin there. That's where we leave it for now. Mark Brandon is alive, but barely. Gerald Paulo still has the sister. Break time equals 05s. And Amber Walter is walking back into the dark with a choice she can't undo. Part 2 is coming. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. If this story had you from the first chapter, hit that like button. Subscribe so Part 2 finds you. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Every town had a law. Every law had a story. And this one? It's far from over.